Welcome to the Q Podcast.
Q is about conversation.
If we're really concerned about ending poverty, we've got to be more concerned about creating justice.
Our cultural products as Christians need to both defy and resonate with the culture.
And God's doing amazing things. His church is expanding. His church is growing.
It's not what's the purpose of my life, it's what is the purpose that's been assigned.
Stay curious, think well, advance good. This is Q.
Welcome to the Q Podcast. I'm Gabe Lyons, and I'm excited about you hearing today's talk because it's zeroing in on something that sometimes for most of us feels so enormous. It's hard to spend time and energy trying to think about how we're going to solve it, and that's the hunger crisis around the world. In this particular talk, we're going to be encouraged. We're going to be encouraged to hear how that problem is being solved, some of the most creative ways that food is starting to get to the people who need it most. But what I think you'll find most interesting is that this work is something that each of us can participate in. It's not just something we have to rely on other entities or governments to do, but each of us has a role to play. Delivering this talk is Dan Clark. He's a great communicator, passionate about the idea of helping people discover their talent, their resources, and knowing how to leverage that for others. He serves as a vice president of partner development at Convoy of Hope, which is a faith-based humanitarian organization that alleviates poverty, disease, and hunger around the world. He's been there for 15 years, but formerly was a pastor. And what I love about this particular talk is how simple he makes it, how encouraged you feel when you realize how close we are to solving a problem that has existed throughout multiple centuries. And so let's listen in, let's be encouraged, let's see how we can play a role in being a part of solving the hunger crisis.
Best-selling author Simon Sinek, he sparked a thought revolution of sorts when he authored his book about inspirational leadership called Start With Why. I'm sure many of you have read it. In it, he asserted that people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And what you do simply proves what you believe. When you examine the ministry of Convoy of Hope, whether you are focused just on the international initiatives, feeding kids, empowering women, training farmers, or whether you take into account Convoy's entire body of work, there is a common thread that's woven into every story. And there's a fundamental issue that we are always addressing. And that's hunger, the lack of nutritious food. A few years ago, I started to ask why? Or more specifically, why should we care about hunger? And this question, it wasn't from an emotional or a spiritual angle, like probably everybody in this room. I got lots of reasons to check those boxes. This was an intellectual inquiry. You might say it was a question of stewardship. Of all the causes that we could invest our energy and our resources in, of all the causes that the church could get behind to help alleviate the suffering that we see in the world, why choose this one? Why not housing or health or jobs? All great causes for sure. So why had Convoy of Hope dialed in on hunger? Of all places, it was in a room full of farmers in Kansas City that the answers started to come. Attending a gathering with the pioneer of our agricultural training program, I began to learn about the impact of food on the development of society. And what I learned, well, it made me want to hug a farmer. Consider this. In the United States, less than 2% of us are directly involved in the production of our own food. But it wasn't always this way. There was a time, thousands of years ago, when we were all hunters or gatherers. Until around 8000 BC, when something transformational occurred. It was arguably the most significant development in the history of the human race. We learned how to farm, how to produce food on a mass scale. And the result was the birth of civilization. Humankind would finally emerge from the Stone Age. Incredibly, this occurred on 4 continents at the same time. Historians, they call it the Neolithic Revolution. Others of us, we might call it divine intervention. Nevertheless, food changed everything. For the first time, countless people could spend their lives pursuing something more than just their next meal. And this pattern, It would repeat itself. In the 12th century, a simple collar enabled horses to pull iron plows harder, faster, and longer than oxen could. The resulting increase in the food supply, it helped lead us to the Renaissance that ushered us out of the Dark Ages. In the 1700s, mechanical reapers, seed drills, fertilizers, these things, they led to dramatic increases in food production. And this in turn helped usher in a new era of prosperity that we know as the Industrial Revolution. You may already know that up until that time, the vast majority of the world's population labored in agriculture. Today, in most industrialized nations, only 1 person out of 50 works in farming. But in Ethiopia, for example, 82% of the population still labors in agriculture, and the majority of those are subsistence farmers. They're still living as if it were thousands of years ago. If not their time, food is costing the poor what little they earn. In the United States, the average person, we spend 9.7% of our disposable income on food costs. But in places like Haiti, and in the Philippines, the impoverished will spend as much as 60% of their incomes on food. Now, certainly, the war against poverty has many complexities. Not long ago, global leaders were introduced to a fresh lens through which the fight against poverty could be viewed, called comprehensive security. This innovative model identifies 7 areas in which a society must achieve reasonable success in order to thrive. Chief among them is food security. Whereas economic security refers to the steady flow of goods and services, and political security is focused on the rule of law, food security is the condition whereby all people have physical and economic access to safe, sufficient, and nutritious food. The results of the scoring are commonly expressed through a radar graph, which demonstrates the interconnectedness among the challenges to success. The premise of this model is that each area has the potential to pull the rest into positive or negative territory. Now, here's where it gets good. Research into the connectedness among these 7 areas found, strikingly, that food security is the only area directly associated with every other aspect of comprehensive security. To put it simply, improvements in the area of food security positively impact every other sector. When you solve the hunger problem, you free entire societies to focus their energy and attention on other challenges and opportunities. Just imagine with me for a moment what advances and innovations have yet to be made because their would-be inventors are still preoccupied with finding their next meal. What if Thomas Edison or Albert Einstein, Madame Curie or Jonas Salk or Bill Gates, what if they had been confined to a field instead of their laboratories? What would the world look like today? What if Billy Graham never made it to the pulpit? Now look, I get it. To the person on the street, feeding all the hungry kids in the world, it probably seems like an idealistic and an unattainable goal. But a recent report released by the Barna Group confirmed what we already suspected to be true, that roughly 70% of the American public has no idea about the progress that's been made. They have no idea that in the last 40 years, the number of children dying of hunger and malnutrition has been cut in half. Friends, this is not a losing battle. The good news, the news that most people have never heard, is that we, the collective we, we're winning. Check this out. From 1990 to 2015, more than 1 billion people were lifted out of extreme poverty. Isn't that incredible? In just the last 36 months of that period, in just the last 3 years, more than 200 million people were lifted out of extreme poverty. The rate of progress, it's accelerating. Another way to look at it, in 1990, roughly 50% of the population in developing countries were living below the poverty line. Today, that number is 14%. It's awesome. Based on these trends, Global leaders believe, and this isn't Dan Clark saying it, this isn't Convoy of Hope saying it, these are leaders who sit on a very high perch and have a very informed perspective. They are telling us that based on the progress of recent decades, that we have an opportunity to eradicate hunger as we know it by the year 2030. Can you just imagine that? Wouldn't that be incredible? Now, yes, we live in a broken world. And there will always be forces that conspire to perpetuate the problem, conflict, civil war, corruption. Needs will arise as a result. But the systemic cycles of poverty and hunger, they can be broken. The proof, it's in the progress. And that wave of momentum creates an incredible opportunity for the church. A very prominent business leader was recently speaking to our board and executive team. Playing off of Jim Collins' book, he was talking about doing good and doing great. I think all of us here, we would agree that feeding a hungry child is noble and good. Doing it in a way that introduces that child to Jesus, that's great. But what if there was a third level, a greater, that by leaning into the problem with such focused intensity that in a decade or two, it doesn't exist anymore. Instead, there would be an entire generation of young people who have been touched by the power of kindness, God's kindness through us. And they are now motivated and working hard to change their own nations. That is the dream. That's our prayer. And by all of us working together with God's favor, we believe it can happen. God bless you.
So you heard Dan say this, but we have the opportunity to eradicate hunger by the year 2030. That's pretty amazing, almost a decade from now, with the right strategy, the right resources, the right thinking. But just amazing to think about how much solving the food problem starts to contribute to solving so many other issues and concerns in our communities. I love it when people think well. I love it when they think well about the one domino that we could touch and set off that would actually start to help our communities flourish and experience the restoration, the rebuilding, all of the things that we know God desires for our communities, for people to flourish. Now, as you think about your role in your own community, maybe hunger isn't the crisis that you're faced with, but there's something else happening in your city that needs to be addressed. Well, on October 24th, it's a compelling night. It's called Q Commons. If you've never been to a Q Commons event, this happens once a year on this one night. Tens of thousands of people gather in small communities, large communities, in homes, around the dinner table, but also in churches as well as in public spaces. And a 2-hour evening is committed to better understanding how can we as Christians be a part of creating a better future in our communities. Go to qcommons.com to see more about this. See if there's one in your city. If there is, attend that. Invite your friends out. Get a ticket for this. You're going to hear Malcolm Gladwell, who's a New York Times bestselling author, whose book just released right now called Talking to Strangers. 65,000 books sold in the first week. People love hearing what Malcolm has to say about our world, about understanding it at a deeper level than just the superficial. And so on this particular evening, he's going to share an 18-minute talk on that. Francis Chan's going to be talking about what it means to build true community. And Rebecca Lyons is going to share about rhythms of renewal. How do we live in such a way that we can operate from a place of strength so that we have something to offer to those in our community who need help, who need support. And you'll also hear from local talks. If you're in a public setting attending Q Commons, you'll hear local leaders addressing your crisis, addressing what is the issue in our city that needs to be exposed. What are the ways we can creatively be a part of solving problems together? And so it's not only a great night of education, but you're going to meet the people in your city, in your community, in your neighborhood who are thinking about these things, who care about these things, but maybe have had nowhere to express that or nowhere to come together and find others of like mind. And guys, you know the power of like-mindedness, of coming together, of seeing that you're not alone in the way that you think about the world, but that there's others that you can carry this with, that you can go shoulder to shoulder with and solve problems and be creative and collaborate. It's a beautiful and an amazing thing. And so I hope you'll join us at Q Commons. Go to qcommons.com, learn more, register today to attend one in your city or to host one in your church or host it at your home. We can't wait for all of us around the world to come together on this one night and think well together and advance good.